What the heck is going on with Xbox? Let's try to make sense of all of it. To say that Xbox fans are feeling a little rejected, under the weather, saddened, or just honestly unsure about the future, I think would pretty candidly be an understatement. Through the past, couple months here, basically in 2024, Xbox has been hit with blows left and right, kicking things off with layoffs of about 1,900 people, and then there were some studio closures this week and sort of a reshuffling of the deck, if you will. The future feels uncertain, if you're going to be honest here. It felt like we've kind of completely shifted from this rocket ride after Microsoft was able to close its Activision acquisition to, like, they put away the credit card and they've pulled out the blade, right? They went from spending money to chopping things off. And so for those of you who are trying to make sense of all this, I've really laid out, I think, hopefully the whole narrative. And I'm going to try to explain this from the perspective of hopefully Microsoft. Now, I don't want people to think, well, this is just Brad trying to defend $1 trillion company. I would like to remind you that I am the reason that this tweet exists. The intent of this is to try to understand what is going on in the world of Xbox from a business perspective that would make them think that cutting studios that just released Hi-Fi Rush, which was one of their best received games lately, is the right move. It is a challenging and tricky environment. Microsoft/Xbox has put itself into a corner, if you will, and they can't spend their way out. They now have to justify everything that they have done. So let's spin back the wheel of time here just a little bit and kind of group up on what is happening so far. So, several years ago, everybody will remember this, Microsoft closes the $7.5 billion Bethesda acquisition. At the time, it was a blockbuster purchase for Microsoft. It made shockwaves. It was such an expensive purchase for their Xbox org, and wow, we had no idea what was actually coming. But at the end of the day, Microsoft spent $7.5 billion on Bethesda, and we also know that they've also spent nearly $70 billion on Activision. And that's not even including things like Mojang and Compulsion and Ninja Theory, and the list just goes on and on and on. Microsoft opened up the checkbook and just started buying up studios, which was clearly part of a strategy, which I don't think many of us would say is a bad strategy. It was very clear that Microsoft sat down and said, look, we bought Minecraft. It was huge for us. I bet we can replicate that success and let's go all in. And so they said, we're going to send it. And that's exactly what they did by buying up these studios and trying to create a content factory of AAA titles, right? They said, look, if we can get to a position where we're launching multiple AAA titles per year, we can launch a subscription service, which we know is Game Pass, and it will be a phenomenal hit. And everybody who's sitting around the boardroom, because again, Phil Spencer can't sign off on an acquisition just like this. It's got to get board approval. And they all said, yeah, we buy that theory. I think it makes sense that this is how we can take Xbox from being a nice business inside of Microsoft into being a growing and healthy and thriving business and potentially try to own the market. And so that is what we have seen, is that Microsoft just reaching its arms out, swiping the credit card, bringing these things in-house for years after years after years. And this was likely phase one of their actual model here, right? They clearly said, this is the business model. We buy, we optimize, we sell. And that was probably, and sell, I mean sell Game Pass subscriptions. I don't mean spin out Xbox. And so that is kind of where 2023 ended, was the end. I guarantee that at the end of 2023, you're like, we're not buying any more studios. You now have to work with what you have. We have given you all the resources financially that you're going to get, and Xbox needs to start growing after this massive investment from the treasury box from Amy Hood. Amy Hood is the CFO over at Microsoft. If you want money, you go to Amy Hood, and then she will give it to you, but you better be planning on to give it back. And now we are in the give it back stage, and Xbox needs to solidify itself as a business. So when you're in the position of, say, Matt Booty or Phil Spencer or any of the Xbox leadership, and you're saying, look, we've got all these assets, we've got all these studios, how can we become more efficient and actually start delivering? Because let's be honest, there's been some major fails. Redfall is a notable title that just completely flopped. Halo Infinite did not meet expectations, and these were big budget titles. These were big budget titles that did not deliver on the expectation of the investment that was given to them. So what does Xbox do? What would you do? Well, you got to start trimming. We've already seen it on the Halo Infinite side. They cleared the deck of management and said, you guys clearly can't do this. You've hurt this brand, and so you're gone. And that has happened on the Halo side, and they're trying to recover from that. And candidly, the latest multiplayer update is actually pretty decent. Although we're hearing again that the narrative, the story storytelling side of it has been canned, to be determined on what actually happens there, but at least multiplayer is still getting love at the end of the day. However, Xbox is not just about doing okay, right? You can't put this kind of money in continuously and expect things to just go well. And so as the time continues to turn here, we're in this phase 2, and phase 2 means it's starting to optimize. And so we're starting to see things like this. Optimization really means headcount reduction. If anybody's listening to this and thinking that Xbox was going to buy up all these studios and be an arbiter of society and not lay anybody off, you have never seen a big company acquire another. It is given, I said it many, many times leading up to the Xbox Activision deal. I said, look, Phil Spencer's spending all this money. His feet are going to be to the fire to then not to optimize, streamline, make things more efficient. And so earlier this year, 1,900 Activision Blizzard staff were let go. That shouldn't have surprised anybody. And it sucks. I'm not trying to say those 1,900 people aren't humans. Like, getting laid off sucks. There's no other way to describe it. It hurts. It's painful. You put your life into a company and they come one day and just like, you know what? You're not worth it. And I've been on the receiving end of a layoff before. It is horrific. And those 1,900 people have my deepest empathy for this sort of thing. But that if you didn't see this coming, then you need to really look at how every single acquisition in history has gone down. If you buy a company for $70 billion and they have a full accounting staff, you don't need that. You don't need the overhead for these sorts of things. It's unfortunate, but you're buying the revenue generating assets, not the people who are doing the accounting. It's just the way it is. And anytime there's going to be an acquisition of nearly any size, layoffs will happen. It's almost a guarantee at the end of the day. And then there's the news from just this week. So earlier this week, Xbox sent out a memo and announced that says, hey, we are closing the developer of Arcane Austin, which was Redfall, then the interesting one, the Hi-Fi Rush developer Tango Gameworks, and more other cuts across Bethesda and elsewhere. Now, Redfall is not all that surprising. We all know what's happened with Redfall. The more interesting thing for me at the end of the day is that Redfall was such a disaster that they're giving up. Like, they're ending development of the game of Redfall. That is how bad it was. And that they looked at it and said, if we shipped an update that might make this more viable to people, do we think we could ever recover the investment we put in? And the answer to that was no. And that tells you how bad Redfall was for Microsoft / Xbox internally, because they're just, it's done. It's done. Like, that's it. And they're actually going to give a refund to people who bought some of the Battle Pass or whatever the equivalent Game Pass or the Battle Pass equivalent or Season Pass. They're doing refunds. Like, that is how bad that went for Xbox after spending all this money on these studios. So just kind of keep that in mind, that things were bad. Now, it doesn't make sense how Microsoft approached this, and there's a lot of blame to go around. People will absolutely start pointing their fingers and saying, was this an Xbox problem? Was this assigning the wrong type of genre game to Arcane out of Austin, which is a very real and viable statement at the end of the day? Like, hey, the first-person shooter probably wasn't the best thing to assign to them. I suspect that the reality is talented developers can make talented games, but I also suspect that there was some timeline issues, right? Building games is increasingly hard, especially when you have big budgets. Big budgets just mean big problems at the end of the day. You have more people, you have more management, you have more logistics, you have more things going on, you have higher expectations. And so that's why this narrative of like, maybe we should make smaller games is starting to come out, because these big budget blockbusters are not, there's no model for guaranteed success. It's not like they're going to go build another X-Men movie or a Transformers movie that will do well. Building a blockbuster game, if you can't get it out, it's just a very hard thing to do. And obviously Microsoft is learning that, and unfortunately a very hard way. So what is Xbox actually going to be doing here? This is where, people like myself who have been following the company for a while start to understand. So if you've ever seen an acquisition like this from Microsoft, they generally follow one or two models, right? There's sometimes the model of like what we're seeing, where they acquire, they slim, and then they try to optimize, and then they try to ship. There's also other models where they say, look, you're just an independent company. Skype is an example of this, I believe. You can just sit over there, continue to do your thing, and then you're going to be able to run yourself. And that's not what we're seeing here. It looks like from these big titles, from these big companies, even Activision, which is, kind of running itself. when you're that expensive, you're not running yourself. You're still reporting up through the org, and you still have that sort of stuff. So Xbox has said this, and I believe this came directly from Matt Booty. He says, to double down on these franchises to invest and build new ones requires us to look across the businesses to identify the opportunities that are best positioned for success. The reprioritization of these titles and resources means a few teams will be realigned to others to get some of our colleagues, and some of our colleagues will be leaving us, and blah, blah, blah. This is corporate speak at the end of the day of, we are cutting things that we don't think can make us money. We are going to put more money, and I say money in quotations here because we don't exactly know what this means, but they're going to put more attention into the titles that they think will actually do well. Like, the easiest example is Call of Duty. It makes sense for Xbox to put more money into Call of Duty because it has a guaranteed formula to generate its returns. It's not risky. They know what to do. They just need to make it a polished experience, ship the title, and they will reap that in. However, along the way, Xbox has been saying we should start making smaller games and we need to be more critical of our investments. But that doesn't really make sense either, because Hi-Fi Rush, which was and please do not attack Aaron. Aaron is a very nice individual. Hi-Fi Rush, as Aaron said about a year ago in April, was a breakout hit, and it did exceptionally well. It got very good Metacritic scores. It was by all means the perfect shadow drop for Xbox, and then we catch word that, like, hey, Tango is being shut down. Now, there's some confusion around this a little bit, because there's the rumors and flying around that the leadership of that studio left, right? Which I think that's a known quantity. And the confusion right now is, like, when the leadership left, did he take a bunch of assets with him? Assets, I'm meaning people, the people that were building the game. I don't know why I called them assets. Assets don't have feelings. People absolutely have feelings. I apologize to those people. But when he left, he took some people with him, and what was left of Tango after Hi-Fi Rush has just kind of been a shell. And so is shutting down Tango really shutting down Tango at the end of the day? The opinions on the internet go both ways, that Tango is not what it used to be, even though Hi-Fi Rush was really good. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. The optics for Microsoft are terrible. However, from an internal perspective, they may look at this and say, Tango isn't what it used to be. But more importantly, I guarantee they sat down, they said, look, if we build Hi-Fi Rush 2, are we going to recover our investment? Is it a good game? Will it make us money? And I suspect that the answer to that was probably not what fans want to hear. That's the only thing that makes sense. The other potential option here is that Xbox may have said, look, we can farm out Hi-Fi Rush 2. The art assets and style is all there. They just got to go make new levels and add some new storyline. We can do that in-house or to anybody else. We don't need a dedicated studio. And if Tango isn't going to be building Hi-Fi Rush 2, what are they going to be doing? Do we want to just give them creative freedom? Well, we don't really have that capacity right now. And so they got chopped. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just trying to add some context about how and why this may have happened at the end of the day. And so the problem that Xbox finds itself in, and this is a pretty genuine problem, after spending all this kind of money, if you're going to launch a new title, if you're going to launch a smaller game, and that's something Matt Booty has suggested, even though what we're seeing here kind of goes in the face of that, is how much money does a title need to make for it to make sense? You got to remember, Microsoft itself is a couple $2 trillion business. So if they're gonna let's use Tango in a theoretical example here. We have a title that Tango can make. It's not Hi-Fi Rush 2. It's a new title or whatever. We will give them $7 million, and in 2 years or 3 years, 3 years is probably more realistic, they're going to put out a title that we expect will add. We'll make $10 million. Pick your number, whatever. I don't know what the number is. Let's say they will make $3 million that they can put into the bank. Is that worthwhile for Xbox to do? If you're a small indie shop, absolutely it's worthwhile doing, because $3 million is your next $3 million investment into your next title. But when you're Xbox and $3 million on that sort of an investment, it may not make sense anymore because you're so large. There's a term in the, too big to fail. Like Microsoft is in this, or Xbox is in this weird thing. It's like too small to succeed, right? Because, oh yeah, you shipped this small game, you shipped it quickly and it did well, but it's not moving the needle for the overall Xbox org, which is a very real problem that Xbox has backed itself into a corner. And you have to understand that when they're looking at investments, right, it's an old Warren Buffett statement that it's easy to find a stock that will make $10,000, but I need to make $10 billion for my investors. Well, how is Xbox going to invest in a title that doesn't make 10,000 but makes 10 billion? Not literally 10 billion, but you guys understand what I mean. And so this is what's happening. These are very real conversations that are happening inside of Xbox. And obviously they have things like Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, Diablo, those sorts of, Fallout is doing exceptionally well, like these big brand titles. And it's like that what Microsoft is going to latch onto, because they know that they at least have the option of getting to that massive return rather than those smaller releases that may not. Even though Xbox's signal like smaller games make sense, when we think small games, it might be very different than what actually Xbox thinks is a small game for it. So what is what is next for Xbox here is a very interesting question. So, and like 2 weeks time, roughly, something rounding an error like that, Hellblade 2 will release. Now there's already a lot of discourse on Twitter and X and Reddit. It's like, is Xbox prepared for Hellblade 2 to be a success, or is this another Redfall? We don't quite know. It looks like it's better than what we expect from a Redfall. I think that's a given at this point, especially the marketing campaign that is behind it. But let's pretend that Hellblade 2 comes out and doesn't do well. I don't even want to think about what that actually means for Xbox, because that is a huge black eye, again, for the Xbox org. It has to succeed. Much like Starfield had to be well received, which it mostly was. It's not perfect. I don't expect Hellblade 2 to be perfect either, but it has to do exceptionally well. And so then we get this, and this is what I've alluded to. It says, I believe this was from Matt Booty. Yes, it was. He says, we need smaller games that give us prestige in awards. Well, you had that. You had that along the way with, what was it? Hi-Fi Rush here. Or, whoops, wrong one. With Hi-Fi Rush. And so, like, that formula existed, and then you dunked the studio out into the ocean, and you're not pulling it back on shore. And so this is the problem. It's not that Matt Booty said this is what we need to do, smaller games. It's the fact that Microsoft now has a contradictory success story that they're no longer grappling onto, because now anytime they bring up Hi-Fi Rush, it doesn't matter. Be like, oh yeah, we released Hi-Fi Rush. It was a great title. Every Xbox fan and gaming fans be like, yeah, and then what'd you do? You shut down the studio. And so this is what I mean, that Microsoft has backed itself into this weird corner of saying this is what we need to do, which is a small title, and then small title succeeds, but it's not good enough for the overall org, and so you shut it down. And this is the conversations that are going on. Like, here's a real sort of thought experiment for you. Would Microsoft have been better off, or Xbox, I should say, of going to Activision and saying, look, we'll give you $1 billion to put Call of Duty on Game Pass? Would that have been a better investment than $70 billion? I don't know what that $1 billion would get you, but Microsoft clearly had the checkbook, and they knew that Game Pass growth is the defining characteristic of success. Would they have been better off? It's kind of hard to say, because I lean towards there would have been a lot less drama doing that at the end of the day, and just investing purely in Game Pass rather than studio production. Because let me break something down for you. When people look at these game studios, Baldur's Gate 3, great example. They say, look at these little independent studios. How do they create such high quality games and then kick them out and make tons of money? Because that's what everybody wants to do. When your only chance at success and livelihood results in a single title release, you put your heart and soul into that. And that's how you get these quality, polished games from small shops. It's not because they have a huge backing, right? If you're an Xbox studio, and maybe this narrative is changing, and that's why we're seeing some things shut down. If you're a big studio and you fail, you're like, well, Papa Microsoft is going to go, open up the checkbook. They're not going to let us fire us all. But if you're a small indie shop and you say, we released this title and it doesn't do well, what happens? You are out of a job. Your dream is literally dead. And so those motivational characteristics are vastly different than what is now inside this massive Xbox publishing arm that has just continuously propped up all these studios. I suspect that going forward, we are going to start to see Microsoft look at studios as independent businesses. And they're going to say, look, if this title comes out and the revenue from that title, now granted, Game Pass muddies that up and they probably have some formula. If this independent studio cannot support itself on the revenues generated from its title, what are we doing supporting them? And it's going to result in some terrible conversations and some very hurt feelings, and it's going to be very bad for Xbox. The problem that Xbox has right now is that they have to become better, viable, and grow faster. And how are they going to become more viable and grow faster? Specifically with Game Pass is the metric, remember, they told us to judge them by. We have to be efficient, we have to launch effectively, we have to launch consistently, and they have to be high quality. That is the mandate to all these studios, and we already know that shipping games is hard. Starfield was late. Literally, like every big title I can think of coming to my head, for the most part, has been delayed in some capacity, which is rough. Which is leading to this, and I can confirm that this is accurate. So Xbox staff is still not done cutting costs. There's some voluntary buyout offers to some ZeniMax staff, and I can confirm what Jason is saying here is accurate. One thing to keep in mind here is that June 30th is Microsoft's end of fiscal year. When Microsoft typically does like wider scale layoffs or reorgs or everything, it's always tied to their fiscal year. Their fiscal year ends in June 30th, which means in July and August, when reorgs happen, that's typically when we see it. Some of this information here, like these layoffs and everything else, where's that, happening out of band from the fiscal year is actually somewhat uncharacteristic. It's not completely uncharacteristic, but typically these things would happen in July. And so the pain inside of Xbox is not over for developing studios and Xbox staff. The good times of the past 3 years of like, hey, we're buying up studios, we're going to launch all these great games. All of those promises that Xbox has made are now coming due, and they have to start delivering. And if studios can't delivering, more hard decisions are going to be made. Because at the end of the day, Microsoft has spent nearly $80 billion buying studios with promises that they could create this factory. If the factory doesn't materialize, the future of Xbox is going to look a lot different than what we expected this time last year. So, there's everything. Now I have a brain dump onto what I believe is sort of the Microsoft view of what is going on. This is a very business-centric company. These are very business-centric decisions, and they are not taking into account the blowback that they are receiving from fans. The fans have been supporting Xbox, and now Xbox is saying like, look, if we want to continue to do what we're doing, we got to make these cuts, and they're not sitting well with their fans. How is Xbox going to recover? It's a great question. Either time will tell us that, hey, slimming up and streamlining their output is the right maneuver to make sure these studios actually release on time with high quality, or it's going to get bad. It's going to get rocky from here on out, and we'll see. I wonder in my mind a lot of times, candidly, and we'll end with this, is Game Pass a sustainable model for gaming? Is it? I don't know. It works very well for content delivery, which is like linear content, things like Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, because it's just streamlined, right? They're not games. Games are inherently harder to build, require potentially bigger budgets. I mean, there's movies with big budgets, but a AAA title is a couple $100 million. Movies can be made for a lot less than that. So the question that I will end with for here, dear listener, is Game Pass a sustainable model for Xbox and the gaming industry? As always, my friends, that wraps it up for this video. Make sure to keep it subscribed here because the only BS on this channel is me.